In the past, I've talked about why I like using things like Pandoc, Markdown, Trough, and LaTeX to do my assignments, but what I wanted to talk about today was why I like using these text formatters and markup languages over things like a what you see is what you get text editor or a rich text editor like LibreOffice, the Microsoft Office Suite, or Google Docs. Now, this isn't to say that these don't actually have a place. I do think they are useful from time to time, and I will be talking about why I do think they are useful towards the end. But I think generally, you're probably better off just always working with a markup language or a text formatter and then only using the rich text editor when you actually need one of the features that does come with it. So the first thing is that the formatting is separate from the text. Now, what I mean by this is, say you're writing a document in, I don't know, LibreOffice, and as you're writing it, you notice that the formatting of the text is a little bit funky. So if you're anything like me, you're probably going to want to fix that as you're actually writing. Even though when you actually go to submit the document or just give the document to someone else, you'll probably do a last minute formatting thing just to make sure everything's formatted the way you want it to be formatted. So instead of wasting time formatting as you're actually writing it, what you should be doing is just writing the document and then just worrying about the formatting towards the end. And when you're using a markup language or a text formatter, that's pretty much all you get to think about because you don't see the output as you're actually writing it. Now, I know there are editors for like LaTeX and Markdown where you do actually see the output. I'm not a fan of those for this exact reason. So as you're writing, say, a LaTeX document or a Markdown document, you're only worrying about the text in the document. So you're focusing on that. And then when you want to have it formatted a specific way, you'll go write your CLS file if you're doing LaTeX. If you're doing Trough, there's another way you can do the formatting. If you're doing Markdown, it will depend on your Markdown processor, but if you're doing Markdown with Pandoc, then it'll be a CLS file as well if you're converting to a PDF. So when you're actually writing, all you're focusing on is the actual document and you're focusing on doing something that actually matters, as opposed to fixing your tabbing in a rich text editor when you should just be doing that at the end. Now, this is more of a me problem, but I'm sure that a lot of other people have experienced the same thing, where they go to edit a document and they find themselves editing the formatting as opposed to the actual text. Now, the next thing is that files for a rich text editor will get out of date. Now, I know you can take a Word document from the first version of Word and run it in the 2020 version of Word. Microsoft Word is a special case though, and some stuff will actually break. And it will break even worse when you try to do something like move between, say, LibreOffice and Microsoft Office, or Microsoft Office and LibreOffice, or either of them to Google Docs. When you try to do that, the files generally just completely break. Whereas if you're doing something like LaTeX, LaTeX is LaTeX regardless of where you put the LaTeX. It will obviously change a little bit depending on the LaTeX engine you're using, but generally it's going to be pretty much the same. The actual command you're writing will stay the same. The output may change a little bit. Now, the other thing is that you don't have to fight with changes to the editor. So I know that a lot of people are using a really old version of Microsoft Office, like 07, 09, because they don't like the new interface for Microsoft Office. And I completely understand that. The new interface, the ribbon interface, it's not even new at this point. It's the newest interface for Microsoft Office is garbage. And the same thing might happen with LibreOffice, obviously, because LibreOffice is open source, someone can go back and fix it. But if LibreOffice decided, okay, we're just changing the interface today, without actually going back and using an older version or actually modifying it yourself, you're kind of stuck with what the developers decide that you get to use for your rich text editor. Whereas if you're using a plain text editor, if changes happen to, say, Vim or Nano, you can just jump to a different editor and what you're actually writing in the editor stays the exact same. If you're doing LaTeX in Nano, it's the same as LaTeX in Vim, is the same as LaTeX in Emacs, is the same thing as LaTeX in Notepad, or even a more complex editor for LaTeX that's specifically built around LaTeX. Regardless of where you're actually writing it, regardless of the actual editor, it's the exact same. And along with that, as I said, you can use any editor you want. If you want to do everything in Vim, like I do, then feel free to do that. If you want to use Nano, then feel free to use that. You don't have to learn some new tool just to be able to write some text. So if you've never used, I don't know, LibreOffice Writer, and you want to do a document in the LibreOffice Writer format, you have to use LibreOffice Writer because otherwise you'll get those compatibility issues we talked about earlier. So you're forced to use a very specific editor rather than the tools that you're actually normally used to. And another cool thing that comes along with this is you can actually build up your own custom toolchains. So if you're using Pandoc Markdown, you can also add Pandoc filters to that, or you can use text to tags and C tags with Troff, or you can do that with Pandoc as well. Or say you don't like the math processor in Pandoc, you can use your own math processor. Or say you want to add a graphing processor, you can add that as well. Whereas if you're using a rich text editor, you're generally going to be limited to what the editor lets you do. Now, some of them will have plugin systems, but there's still a limit of what you can actually do in that editor. Whereas if you're working with a markup language or a text formatter, you can just add a couple of extra layers of steps to the processing chain and have a completely different output. One example of this is with Pandoc. So I use a filter by the name of Pandoc Crossref because by default, Pandoc doesn't have a way to do things like reference a section or reference a figure. Whereas if you use this filter, it'll add a new binding you can have, and when it recognizes that binding, it'll basically say, okay, here's a section, and here's a section reference. Okay, so those are clearly linked together, and then in the output, it's going to say, this is section 1, referencing section 1 wherever it is that you're referencing it. So that is something that just isn't possible with a lot of rich text editors. Now, another thing is, because of tools like Pandoc, it is very, very easy to convert from, say, a LaTeX document to a Markdown document to an HTML document to whatever it is you want to use. You want to do things in man pages, for example. You can do that. Now, for some of these rich text formats, you can actually convert to and from with Pandoc. Not all of them, though, so just keep that in mind. Now, the problem with that is the same problem with moving an ODT file to docx. The actual layout of the document will completely change, whereas it's a bit easier to convert, say, a LaTeX file to Markdown, especially because Pandoc can take advantage of Pandoc Markdown, where if it can't do something, it can kind of just embed LaTeX in the Markdown file. I'm sure there are probably other benefits that I didn't think of, but those are the ones that I could come up with. Now, as for the positives of using a rich text editor, so unless everyone is agreeing that we are writing with Markdown or we are writing with LaTeX, collaboration kind of just goes completely out of the window. Now, I know that if you're doing, say, a research paper with a group of people, you're probably going to do it with something like Overleaf or some other online collaboration tool to all work on a LaTeX document together. It's a bit harder to get people to agree to do their assignments in Markdown as a group or do it in Troff as a group. So it can be done, and like I said before, you can convert to, say, like a docx file and then collaborate like that. It's just also a bit finicky like that as well, so it's probably a bit easier just to all agree on working on one format and then just working on that one format alone, because otherwise just might be a bit of a problem. Now, the other thing is that if you're not used to working with text formatters or markup languages, writing a plain text document can be a bit confusing depending on which editor you're using. Obviously, you don't have to use something like Vim or you don't have to use Nano. You could do everything in like VS Code if you wanted to. But if you're not used to working with documents like that, it is still a little bit confusing because you do have to remember these commands that you wouldn't otherwise have to remember. Because if you're using, say, a rich text editor, all of those commands would be buttons. So you just have to remember the location of the button. Some people, I guess, might find that harder to do than remembering just a command. It will really depend on the sort of person that's actually working on the document. For me, I find it a bit easier to just remember some commands, or even better, just remember some key bindings for, say, Vim to output the content of that command. So, as I said, it will depend on the sort of person in this case, but generally I just find it easier to remember these commands. If you do have some problem with it though, there are actually dedicated editors that actually work with, say, LaTeX or Markdown. I don't know if there's one for Troff. There might be. I don't know. Someone let me know in the comment section down below if there's a dedicated Troff editor. I know there's ones for LaTeX and Markdown and HTML and whatever else is out there are Markdown. But what about Troff? Is there one for Troff? I've never looked for it, so there could be, but as I said, not sure about it. But I think that's pretty much everything I want to talk about in this video. I'm going to do a separate video on an introduction to Pandoc, and then also all of the things that I use to actually make Pandoc a reasonable way to work on assignments. So keep your eyes open for that one if that sounds like it's going to be interesting. But before I go, I just want to thank my patrons. So a special thank you to Joachim, Nathan, Tiki, Andrew, Platinum Dog Road, Tony Okulari, and Silver. If you want to join the Patreon, there'll be a link to my Patreon down below, so be sure to check that out. I've also got my Amazon affiliate links where you can buy the gear I use on this channel, or just anything else you want, and I've got a small kickback for it. Also remember to go check out my podcast, Tech Over Tea. That'll be available on YouTube and on Library for the video version, and just anywhere you can watch podcasts for the audio version. I think I'll be moving the date for the audio version forward a bit to when the library version goes up, so just keep your eyes open for that one if you like the audio version. Also remember to go smash the like button and leave me a comment down below, and remember to subscribe and ding the bell icon down below as well. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out. It took me 10 tries to read this list out. That's how annoying some of these names are. Elkulari, please get a better name. Platinum Dot, I've already accepted that your name is too long. But Elkulari. LQ is very, very difficult for me to say, so I might start calling you Larry. We'll see how it goes. But anyway, as I said, I'm out.